So welcome, everyone, to the inaugural public forum of our new Center for Ethics and Values. We are delighted to have you all here for our discussion of journalism, ethics, and democracy. I'm Jessica Pfeiffer. I'm the chair of the philosophy department where the center is housed. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that UMBC was established upon the land of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. Over time, citizens of many more indigenous nations have come to reside in this region. We humbly offer our respects to all past, present, and future indigenous people connected to this place. And while we recognize the importance of acknowledging those who came before us, we also know that this is a small gesture, and we must take action toward the necessary work of repair. The mission of our center, the Center for Ethics and Values, is to foster thoughtful, informed, and nuanced exploration of pressing ethical issues we face. Ethical issues are everywhere. We face ethical decisions in nearly everything we do, in our work, in our research, as students, as teachers, in our families, in our friendships, in deciding what to eat, in deciding whether to go to a public forum, in deciding where we get our news, or what shows to watch, or what social media to use, in deciding how to vote, and so on. These public forums provide an opportunity for us to come together as a community, including not only the community within UMBC, but also the wider community that UMBC serves, to work together to gain a deeper understanding of the serious ethical issues we face. The public forums bring together experts in ethics with those who face those ethical issues. This event today wouldn't be possible without our co-sponsors, the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, the Drescher Center for the Humanities, the Center for Social Science Scholarship, the Center for Democracy and Civic Life, the Department of English, the Department of Media and Communication Studies, the Department of Political Science, and the Women's Center. And a special thanks to Vanessa Capuano, without whom nothing the center does would be possible. We hope you will also join us at future events, all at 7 p.m. in this location. On November 7th, we will have a post-election 2024 debrief and dialogue featuring experts from UMBC, Mylea Cromer, Carolyn Forestier, and Michael Nance. On February 27, we will have a discussion of neuroscience, free will, and moral responsibility with a dialogue between neuroscientists, philosophers, and legal scholars. On April 8, there will be a discussion of the ethics of artificial intelligence, featuring one of the architects of ethical AI at Salesforce, a specialist in neurodiversity in AI, in conversation with a philosopher who specializes in AI. And on May 8, we will have our annual Evelyn Barker Memorial Lecture featuring Samuel Scheffler speaking about existential catastrophe and the love of humanity. We hope to see you there. For more information about these events, please take a brochure. Visit us at ethics.umbc.edu, follow us on social media, or sign up to receive our newsletter. And now I would like to introduce the inaugural director of the center, Professor Whitney Schwab.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. So as Jessica said, I'm Whitney Schwab. I'm an associate professor here in the philosophy department, and I'm the inaugural director of the Center for Ethics and Values. And so one of the things, part of our hope in creating the center was to tap into an already vibrant interest in the issues that the center is going to explore and discuss and provide forum for discussing. And given the turnout, I think our hope was not misplaced. So what I want to do now is just introduce each of our speakers and our moderator. So right to my left here is Joe Saunders. Joe Saunders is an associate professor in philosophy at Durham University in the UK. He works on ethics and agency in Kant and the post-Kantian tradition, the philosophy of love, and perhaps most prominently for this setting, media ethics. He's published numerous articles on these topics in a wide range of prestigious volumes, including the European Journal of Philosophy, Ergo, the History of Philosophy Quarterly, and the British Journal for the History of Philosophy. And he's recently edited with Carl Fox the Routledge Handbook of Philosophy and Media Ethics and the 2019 collection, Media Ethics, Free Speech, and the Requirements of Democracy. To Joe's left is Kimi Yoshino. Kimi is the editor-in-chief of the Baltimore Banner and has served in that role since it was launched in 2022. The Banner's mission is to serve as an indispensable resource that strengthens, unites, and inspires our community, and it is doing so in the face of a current economic landscape that is, to put it mildly, kind of stacked against journalists. Under her leadership, the Banner has grown at a rapid rate since its launch, and in addition to her editorial duties in that role, she also writes pieces insisting on the importance of newsrooms to democracy and that shine a light on the inconsistent levels of transparency in various governmental agencies. Before coming to Baltimore, she was managing editor at the Los Angeles Times, where she worked for 21 years. At the time, she helped guide the paper's investigation into corruption in the city of Bell, which was awarded the Pulitzer Gold Medal for public service. To Kimi's left is Melissa Block. Melissa was a longtime NPR host and correspondent. From 2003 to 2015, she was host of NPR's well-known program, All Things Considered. She reported on a range of issues across the globe, from the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina on the Gulf Coast to the effects of the massive 2008 earthquake in Sichuan, China, which killed almost 70,000 people and injured nearly 400,000. Her reporting on the earthquake received the George Foster Peabody Award and DuPont Columbia Award. From 2015 to 2023, she served as an NPR special correspondent, reporting on issues ranging from LGBTQ rights to the big lie, from guns and suicide to opioid addiction. Her contributions to journalism have been widely recognized and awarded. She's a recipient of a 2019 Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism, as well as the 2019 Lifetime Achievement Award for the Fulbright Association. And then to Melissa's left is Professor Michael Nance, who is an associate professor in the philosophy department here at UMBC, and I turn it over to him for the discussion.
Okay. So thanks everybody for being here, and thanks to our panelists for being here. I just will say just a little bit about what the format is going to be, and then we'll jump in. So we're going to spend, I'm going to spend about 40 minutes, give or take, maybe 45 minutes, asking questions, posing questions for discussion with our panelists, and then at that point, we'll turn it over to audience questions for about the last half hour of our time together. So if you're thinking about questions as you listen, don't worry, you'll get your chance. So I want to start off with a sort of flat-footed question, which is, what is journalism? And let me try to motivate the question a little bit more, right? When I think about a journalist, I think, well, what's a journalist do? A journalist is somebody who goes out in the world, investigates the world, and then reports on what they find, right? But then other people also do that, right? Historians do that, for example. Academics of different types do that. Crime scene investigators do that, right? So what is it, in your view, that's distinctive about the practice of journalism? Anybody want to start?
Well, I think part of the mission of journalism is that you're serving a community, right, in a way that the other professions that you talk about are not focused on in quite the same way. So a journalist typically is embedded in a community, is responsive to that community, and in some cases is really trying to foster community in the area where they are. Journalism is also just a lot more fun and a lot more interesting than the other things you mentioned. No offense to the academics here, but there's an element of storytelling and creativity in a lot of journalism that I think distinguishes it from some of the other things you mentioned. And you know, the essential mission of fact-finding, truth-telling, exposing injustices, I think, are also to some extent unique to journalism. Kimmy?
Yeah, I think, you know, you said that very well. I would add that I think there's a certain element of journalism where accountability and transparency are part of that mission. There is sort of, the public's right to know some of these things, that not every profession that you mentioned feels that same responsibility to the public. I agree, there's also creativity and sort of a humanness to it. I mean, with no offense to the academics in the room,
We're really not here to beat up on you.
Reading journalism, reading stories all of it should be translated into very plain language that is accessible and understandable to anyone, really.
Yeah, great. Joe, got anything to add?
How dare you? Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's interesting to think through the contrast with academia. So I suppose that's one key part of it, is that journalism's kind of inherently public-facing, right? You're embedded in the community and you're kind of presenting in the community. Whereas academia can get a little bit closed off. I mean, we have students, so it's kind of public. Don't want to say it again now.
I don't know.
Shall I keep
Maybe
talking?
move it?
Move it a bit? Move it a bit. Is that better? Yeah?
A little better? Yeah.
No? We're taking suggestions, is it? Did someone say move down a bit? Further down?
Yeah.
All right, cool. If that doesn't work, we'll take more suggestions as well. Okay. Is that better? The feedback's still there, though, isn't it? Hi, everyone. So, the contrast between academia and journalism. Yeah, you're right. So one is that journalism's more inherently public-facing. Academics can try it, events like this, but a lot of our research ends up being quite kind of cloistered off. And there are downsides to that, but there are also advantages to it as well. It means we can get involved in quite specialist, difficult conversations. But a downside is that academia can kind of lose sight of accessible, plain language and ways of making clear what their research is to the public. The other difference I was thinking of, which hasn't come up yet, is pace. So academia is slow, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if I wanted to publish a paper, if I had an idea and thought, I'll publish that, it would take me about 2 to 5 years, I think, to publish it. And that's not just because I'm slow, which is true, but the publishing process can take years. Now, again, there are virtues and vices to that. The virtue is I'll get a lot of feedback. I get more feedback than I want, right, on this kind of paper. But the downside is it's really hard to be on the pulse. Like something that I wrote that came out now would have been written with 2018 to 2019 in mind. Mm-hmm. Again, there are strengths to that, but it's hopeless for actually really engaging with issues that the world's facing right now.
Good. So the next question is for Kimmy and Melissa, because I want to hear about your experience as practicing journalists. And in particular, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role that ethics and values play in the sort of mundane, everyday life of a practicing journalist. Yeah?
Sure. I mean, it's in some ways it's a little bit hard to answer that question because it literally infuses every decision that we make just naturally. Sometimes these decisions come after a lot of discussion and deliberation. Do I also need to hold mine?
No,
and we actually have significant debates. I'll give you an example. There was an incident, I'm probably going to not remember the exact facts, but there was an incident not that long ago where a young girl, I think, there was a suspect for something. and he was on the loose, and people didn't know where he was, but he was a minor, and he was a suspect in a crime. And we typically do not name minors who are arrested or even charged. And there was a lot of discussion about whether we should name him as a suspect while he was still on the loose. And we had to have a lot of discussions about that. And ultimately, we did not name him in either case. Sometimes when the crime is extremely serious, we will have discussions about whether or not to name a suspect then. But these are really, weighty questions. And then there are questions around photography, around, how we depict things, how we show things. And then there are, everyday ethics and values related to, there was a lot of discussion, or there's been a lot of obvious discussion around Israel. And, if we do a story on Israel, do we need to do a story on, Israel issues? Do we need to kind of come back and do another story reflecting another point of view? So, it's an everyday balance.
And I think a lot of it is probably intuitive if you're doing your job right, that you're thinking about these things, not necessarily conscious that you're thinking of them, but that they are sort of a part and parcel of how you approach your work. Are you being fair? Are you asking questions equally of multiple perspectives that may not coincide with your own? Are you presenting as balanced and full a picture as you want? I think also a lot about sort of what we owe the people that we talk to. One of the last beats that I had was covering LGBTQ issues, and in particular in transgender issues. And I was talking to a bunch of kids, trans kids and their families, and trying to make sure that they understood that what they were saying was going to be aired nationally, it would live on the web. Were they aware of the public face that they were assuming, and in some cases, protecting their identities, but just sort of that kind of ethical equation or balancing of what you are asking people to do and what you owe them as people who are sharing their stories with you, I think is a key part of how I approach my reporting, at least. And then, I think we talk a lot about, and I'm sure we'll talk later about the dissolution of trust in journalism, and I think part of the ethics and the values that we place as journalists and as reporters and editors is how do we build back that trust, and how do we do our jobs in a way that people will trust the product that they're listening to or reading or watching.
Yeah, that's great. I like the sense that that both of you have said that you're working with a sense of obligation both towards the public, right? And also a sense of obligation towards the individuals who you're reporting about, right? And trying to balance these things. Sounds tough.
Even sources who you're dealing with, either victims of crime or people who are in different, have gone through some horrible situation, or, suspects or bad politicians, or criminals. I think we always weigh how we treat our sources down to, are we giving them enough time to answer these questions? So it's so embedded in how we operate, the value system, the ethics, that it all the time. It's top of mind, or it's instinctual.
One thing I've noticed too, and this is just a small point, but I think it speaks to this bigger question of who do we trust, and are we sort of showing our values up front? I noticed in particular the New York Times has gotten very deliberate about, in their reporting at the top or at the back, mentioning this reporter talked to 12 people over the course of 6 weeks in these 5 states. Trying to pull back the veil more than typical, and being as transparent as possible in terms of how the reporting was done, and hopefully fending off some questions about how could they possibly know that. They only worked on this story for a day. I think it helps credibility. I don't know that it's terribly widespread, but I think it's a really interesting approach that I appreciate them taking. I don't know if other papers are doing the same thing, but I've noticed it specifically with the Times.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll just add to that, the transparency, I think, is increasingly important. I mean, even with a lot of important data projects that we will work on, we will publish our work like on GitHub or something so that people can see it and vet it if they want to.
Fascinating that you both, yeah, it's working. Fascinating that you both mentioned that the kind of like ethical concerns and reflection were just kind of part of the day-to-day practice of being a journalist. So there was a project that I was part of in Europe that went to try and investigate what the best countries in the world were doing with their medias, the best countries in the world on the Press Freedom Index. Mm-hmm. So it's the usual suspects. It's Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Switzerland. So we sent a team of researchers over to these countries, and we went and interviewed journalists and editors and people who worked in media regulation. And basically the questions were, you're at the top of the Press Freedom Index in the world. What are you doing in your day-to-day activities? And why is it different than what's happening in the UK, which has quite a kind of toxic press that kind of infects society, I think. And we got this answer where they just said, like, every day we're making ethical decisions. It's always, and part of that is that it seemed that it was always legitimate to raise an ethical concern. So no matter where you were in the organizational chain, if someone came to you and said, we're going to run this story or we're doing this, it would be fine to ask, well, is that fair? Or the type of issues you raised, Kemi, they came up a lot. Actually, that person's a minor. Is it okay to name them? Should we be careful about that? Should we allow that person to have a right of reply? Is that fair to our source? And what struck me at the time when I was interviewing these people and chatting to them is I thought, like, I've had like bad jobs over the course of my life. Like, I used to work in bars in London, like, horrible places run by horrible companies. And it's true. and I remember once I tried to raise an ethical concern, and it was as if I asked something like, do you know what the minerals on Mars are? I mean, it was just an entirely alien concern. Those are not our concerns. Our concerns are pleasing the higher-ups by making money and pleasing the higher-ups by keeping our staff in check. Raising an ethical concern just wasn't done. And that's why it was a kind of toxic work culture. And it's just interesting that when you interview people who work in well-functioning cultures or organizations that are well-functioning, they will note that ethical concerns are taken really seriously and are part of the kind of day-to-day fabric of the kind of culture. It's hard to bring about, it's hard to change when you don't have it, but it seems kind of crucial to kind of a well-functioning organization and media too.
That's great. So, I mean, something that Melissa brought up is the issue, and actually I think Kemi mentioned it too, is the issue of trust and transparency. So, I mean, there's been lots of discussion, certainly in the United States, I'm sure in the UK as well, about an overall decline in people's trust in the media. And that is connected in sort of complicated ways to changes in the places that people get information from, like social media. It's connected to increases in political polarization. And so I would like, it'd be great to hear a little more on your thoughts about the way forward to sort of restore people's trust in media institutions, which is so crucial for a democracy to function, right? And the role that ethics and values need to play in that process. Yeah.
Well, I mean, let's be clear about one thing. I mean, obviously, trust in journalism has been going, distrust of journalism is not a new phenomenon, but we have politicians now who are calling journalists the enemy of the people. And if there's anything that's going to erode trust in journalists, I think we can point to that specifically because it's toxic and it's dangerous and it's violent often. So I think part of the solution would be to have politicians stop calling journalists the enemy of the people and to act on those beliefs. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about people who have articulated the fears about what the deterioration of trust means for democracy. And I wanted to read something actually that I brought with me because the Philippine investigative journalist Maria Ressa, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021, has written a lot about this. And she said, she was talking about the perils of disinformation and what it means for democracy. And she said, the goal of disinformation isn't to make you believe one thing. The goal is to make you disbelieve everything, to make you doubt everything, to make you distrust everything. Because if you do, then you don't do anything. This is corrosive. It's like termites eating wood. And before you know it, you just step and fall through, which I thought was an incredibly powerful metaphor to think about. What does it mean when we distrust institutions? What happens to civil society? What happens to democracy? So I would just put that out there as sort of a starting point for the conversation. Obviously, the questions of what you do about that are huge, and I'm not sure that any of us are going to have answers on this stage, but I think it's a really important thing to consider as we talk about this tonight.
Yeah. I have had the privilege of hearing Maria Ressa speak. I would, if you guys want to feel inspired, Google her, and pretty much anytime she opens her mouth, she's hugely inspiring. Your point cannot be underemphasized. It's or overemphasized. It's the notion of truth and what truth is and what facts are have been completely distorted over the last several years because our job as journalists rests in the ability to deliver facts and to deliver truth. And we now have people who are in jobs who should be truth tellers and have not always been so. But more now than before, I think, use truth and use facts, very loosely, in ways that I think have made the act of journalism even more important than it has ever been, which is ironic because it's more under attack and less trusted than it has ever been. So that's not a good, those are not good things happening at the same time. And I don't know how to change that part of it because we have just moved into a completely different era of, I think, people's own personal responsibility or feeling that they need to actually tell the truth as part of their job. Let me just kind of take this from a kind of a national to a very local level. And I will just say, as a local news organization, one of the problems I think has been both at the LA Times, where I worked for years, and in Baltimore, there have been legacy news organizations that have been around for more than 100 years. And their track record in how they covered or didn't cover really significant events, has made certain communities distrust them, and for good reason. If you go back over the course of, any newspaper really, you will find numerous occasions of racial slurs, really inaccurate, unfair reporting. One of the benefits of being a startup is you don't come with all of that baggage. You immediately begin to build it up the second that you start publishing, but you at least are starting with a little bit of a blank slate. And, I think one of the things that we have tried to do in Baltimore is show up to the places that have not previously either been covered or seen reporters in their neighborhoods, and not just show up when someone is shot on the corner. So I think that's part of it, just being present. I mean, the other part is, and this is something that we've seen in our industry, is that journalists have, there has not always been a lot of diversity on the staffs of news organizations. And Baltimore, for example, is a majority black city. I do not have a majority black newsroom, but we have tried to hire journalists who are a better reflection of the community. We still have a lot of work to do on that front, but I think it's important. I think it's important when you're knocking on people's doors and when you're showing up at meetings.
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? I mean, I think the problem and the solution are both going to be holistic. So hang on. The problem isn't just that trust in journalism's declining, right? Trust in public institutions more broadly, trust in democracy across the board. It's not just that if we could fix the media, everything else would fix it. It's kind of a bigger problem than that, which is worrying. I think you're right. This kind of sowing doubt. I mean, it's a kind of a thing that I think we have to combat if we want to improve societies. We've got to combat apathy, cynicism, doubt about everything, and I think that's kind of part of the kind of toxic media environment that we find ourselves in, one where people are deliberately fostering those sort of attitudes. Makes it hard. So, I mean, I guess, Mike, your question a bit was what to do about it. So I had a couple of thoughts, but they're just... So one is this transparency about the process. So I was reading someone talking about this where they thought that their suggestion was, as a journalist, instead of claiming to be neutral or objective, just have some values, but be upfront and transparent about them. That way, there's no worries that you're kind of not being fully objective. You've just got a set of values, you're upfront and transparent about them. And I wondered if you thought the kind of New York Times suggestion works, or is that helpful? Does it change anything? Or in the political climate we're in, it basically is doing nothing?
Does it work? I don't know. I mean, I think any gesture of transparency is a good thing. I appreciate it as a journalist because I'm always wondering, how did they do that? How long were they working on that story? But for a general reader, I don't know. But I just think it's a step in the right direction. And I think to the extent that news organizations can be more transparent about the work that we do, how we do it, whether it means engaging directly in the community and going out and having public forums and explaining the work that we do, I think that's all to the good.
The other thought is, I mean, it's a simple one. Regulation, right? I mean, we've got some real bad actors and they need to be regulated. One thing that showed up as part of that project that we did was that the countries, so we interviewed a bunch of people in Norway, and they all insisted that self-regulation was the key to the whole thing. So they're not regulated by an external authority. There's nothing legally binding about it. They just all subscribe to a press council and they regulate themselves. But they take that really seriously. So I asked them, the very high levels of public trust in their media. And I said, why? And they said, well, they know if we get something wrong, we're going to be upfront, let you know we got something wrong. We're going to be really embarrassed about it. So we try not to get things wrong and it works. But then that left me kind of cold because I was like, well, wonderful for you in Norway, right? Like, I'm glad everything's working out so well for you there. But in the UK, we're not in that state. People don't trust media. Newspapers don't regulate themselves. So how the hell are we supposed to get there from here? It seems like it will require some kind of, intervention in order to get rid of bad actors. But yeah, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, in the UK, there's also a very strong tabloid culture, right? And as part of that, there are a lot of unnamed sources who are providing fodder. And, I think that's another ethical and value judgment, right? When do you use an unnamed source? Do you use unnamed sources? I think the most trustworthy news organizations use them very sparingly. And when they do use them, they provide a reason for why. As opposed to that's basically how it's every story about, Meghan Markle has an unnamed source.
All right, so that's great. So I definitely take the point that, I mean, sort of lack of, or the decline in trust in media, right? I mean, it's not a media problem necessarily, right? It's a problem for the media, right? But it's a symptom of a much broader sort of toxic stew of developments in our political culture, for example, right? So I was going to ask about this anyway, and it's connected. So I'm curious to hear, I mean, obviously authoritarian governments and authoritarian politicians are not fans of free media, of truth-telling media. There's been a rise in authoritarian attitudes towards media in the United States. And I'd be curious to hear from Melissa and Kimmy in particular about how does that affect, like, how do those trends actually impact the sort of day-to-day way that journalists work in a society in which there's this sort of rising sort of current of not just distrust, but even sort of hostility, right? How does that make a difference?
In this country,
Yeah.
you're talking about in this country.
Yeah.
I mean, Kimmy might be able to speak more directly to this, but I think a lot of news organizations are really rethinking how they deploy their reporters in the world and the training that they're giving, if they have the resources to do it. And that's one key question I think here, is that all of these things we're talking about, they take resources, they take money. So if you were going to be sending reporters to a political rally and there's a concern of violence, you know, maybe you have trained them ahead of time about what to do in that situation. But I think a lot of news organizations are thinking really carefully about the situations that they're putting their reporters into and the environment in which they might find themselves and how best to protect them. And I think they're also, a lot of them in a very positive side, are thinking very clearly ahead of time about the upcoming election and how can we game out ahead of time the scenarios we might be seeing and how we will report on efforts to disrupt the vote or to contest the vote or to say everything is rigged, and to sort of game that out ahead of time so that we're not blindsided. But again, all of those things are much easier for a well-funded, well-resourced news organization to do that has many, many, many reporters and editors and people thinking about that. It's not so easy for smaller papers, smaller radio stations.
Yeah, I mean, we are currently just now beginning to grapple with this a little bit. We recently worked on a year-long project with the New York Times about opioid overdoses in Baltimore. And a photographer who's been involved in that project has found herself in some scary situations. And she was like, the New York Times has this system where they track their people. And I was like, great for the New York Times. How are we going to do it? But we have sort of found a way to do it ourselves. And it's actually through geolocation and WhatsApp. And we're doing it. But we were literally also just talking today about the election and what happens, you know, we don't really do a lot of national politics, but you know, this election is very interesting for a number of different reasons. We're so close to DC. The question was raised, what if something happens after the election? Would we cover that? Do we have gear if we wanted to send people? Gear meaning, you know, bulletproof vests and gas masks and things like that. These are not, you know, these are things that have come up, you know, sporadically over the years, but are really more part of the conversation now than they were, you know, 10 years ago, although I guess during various, you know, war protests and whatnot, it's come up, but, you know, we do think about that a lot.
Yeah, that's eye-opening, yeah. Okay, so my last, I think, major topic of discussion that I would love to hear from you all about is money. and the role of money, ownership structures of media organizations. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the ethical issues that come up with the way I guess in the United States and in the UK and also elsewhere, the way media organizations are owned and controlled. So what are the ethical issues around the political economy of journalism, I guess you could say?
Do you want to start? You have deep expertise in this
Sure.
question.
I mean, we are sort of in the middle of this right now in Baltimore. The Baltimore Banner is founded and mostly funded at this point by Stuart Bainum. He owns a hotel chain. He's a former state lawmaker in Maryland, very wealthy individual. Gave us $50 million to get started. He also happens to be a pretty significant Democratic donor, a big Biden fundraiser, and has given significantly to the Democratic Party. When we launched, I actually asked him before I took the job, what do you see as your role as owner in terms of my job as editor? And he said, I will not get involved in your editorial decisions. And I said, the money that you give to the Democratic Party could be an issue. He did not want to stop funding Democrats, but he agreed to not give in Maryland. And I'm happy about that. He actually went on the record right before Biden dropped out saying he thought Biden needed to drop out, and I saw his name and I was like, oh man, why did he do that? But that's his prerogative. From a news gathering standpoint and from a coverage standpoint, he has been absolutely true to his word. He does not tinker. He does not lean on me. He does not lean on the staff. He does not intervene. I think he is frankly unusual as an owner, as a hands-off owner. We have been in the middle of kind of watching the Baltimore Sun ownership change play out. For those of you who are following, you know that it was purchased earlier this year by David Smith. David Smith is the chairman of Sinclair Media. He bought the paper as an individual, not as the chairman of Sinclair. But he is a significant contributor to Baltimore politics. He is deeply involved in Baltimore politics. He's funding ballot initiatives, funding candidates. And frankly, I would be extremely uncomfortable with that if I were the editor of the Baltimore Sun working for him. I think, I don't know. I mean, I think if you're a reader of the Sun, you have to kind of judge for yourself whether you think you're seeing changes on the pages of their news. We hear from people all the time who think it is changing. I think it is changing some. At the very least, I think they need to disclose their conflicts, which they've gotten better at, I think, under pressure from journalists working there. But I think it's a problem. I mean, I would not want to work. I would not want to be working in that situation. I guess I'll just say that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't come from the world of newspapers, and I come from public media, which is its own strange beast in terms of funding. But I mean, you certainly have seen in Sinclair as a prime example of consolidation of media ownership among a very powerful small group of people. And what that does to coverage, I think, is probably patently obvious, that you're narrowing the point of view, your perspective is massively shrunken when you have such concentration of ownership among such a small group of people. And I mean, I think in terms of public broadcasting, which is again just such an anomaly in the world of media, You know, it was founded through the Public Broadcasting Act. It was a government initiative at the outset. Right now, a huge amount of the revenues that come into public radio are from listeners, number one, who give, I'm sure all of you do, to your local public radio station, also from philanthropy and from corporate underwriting. And the danger of corporate underwriting, as we all know, is that when the economy tanks, corporate underwriting goes away. And because the media landscape now is so diffuse and corporations and businesses have a lot more places to put their money, it makes the economic situation much more precarious. So NPR is one of a number of organizations that have cut staff, you know, where there have been just pretty dramatic reductions in staff across the board. I don't know about the Banner. I think you guys are growing, but for so
But the
many
LA Times,
newspapers,
where I
it's
used
just
to work.
cut.
Yeah.
And the people who tend to buy them are not looking at them as great journalistic ventures. They're looking at them as businesses, and they're looking at profits, and they're cutting. And that's, you know, that's the sad story of what we've seen so much over the last, I don't know, 10, 20 years.
Yeah. Would you say that the NPR funding model is relatively good for editorial independence?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think we don't feel, well, I say we, even though I don't work there anymore, but I still feel like I belong to it. We don't feel beholden to any of the corporate underwriters. I mean, we try to be transparent when we are reporting, for example, on Amazon, which is a funder. I mean, you can see that it sort of raises questions all the time about who are we taking money from and how can we report on them carefully, but I've never felt any pressure one way or the other based on who our funders are. And there's really pretty robust firewall between editorial. There's a complete firewall between editorial and development, so.
Yeah, okay, good. But the funding stream is like sort of not as reliable perhaps, right? As
Depends
something
on-
like
depends
the
on the
Banner.
Well,
economy.
the banner is rapidly spending Stuart Bainham's money, and therefore reliant on subscriptions, which hopefully you all are subscribing, and donors. And we have a very robust donor network in the area, including from foundations in town. And there are people. We have a whole education team that's funded through philanthropy. And I think, you know, when you accept those kinds of gifts, it comes with the, you know, understanding, the explicit understanding that you are not directing our coverage. You want more education reporting, we want more education reporting, that's great, but you are not telling us which stories we're writing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I've got a bit of, I had a worry about journalism, economy, and democracy, and how those things fit together. So I'm a philosopher, so it kind of takes an abstract form, the worry, but then thankfully there are concrete examples in the real world. So the abstract form of the worry is pretty simple, right? So I take it that a key part of the ideal of democracy is that we all have equal political power. So it's not often expressed like that, but I take it it's crucial. So if we were going to democratically decide something here tonight, it would be crucial that we each got one vote, right? Then we could we receive some information, we'd think about it, we could take a vote. If I got 1,000 votes and you all got one vote, we could still receive the information, deliberate and everything, but it wouldn't be a democracy because we don't have equal political power. I would have an outsized influence, right? So if that's right, then democracy requires equal political power. Fairly simple starting point. Then you just think in our societies, we allow for vast inequalities of wealth, right? Well, if that's the case, we're immediately in trouble because we have this ideal of equal political power, but we're allowing vast inequalities of wealth. Well, what we better do is make sure that those vast inequalities of wealth don't translate into inequalities of political power. Don't allow people to literally buy votes. Make sure we have limits on lobbying, political advertising, and things like that. But another huge one is the media. So again, let's say that we're going to decide something collectively here tonight, but there are 2 or 3 news organizations that are going to present us with the information. I no longer have 1,000 votes, but I just go, well, I'm going to buy them. I'll buy all 3 news organizations and I'll lean on them, right? I'll lean on them and I'll press them. Then you might think, okay, well, we've still only each got one vote, but it's not really a healthy democracy because we're not receiving news in a kind of impartial way. In that picture, I've still got way too much political power. So the thought is simple. Democracy requires equal political power. Vast inequalities of wealth allow for vast inequalities of political power. One way that happens is through media ownership and influence. So I'm a philosopher. That's a kind of abstract way of putting the point. It's also just the world we live in, right? Rupert Murdoch, one individual, has way more political power than all of we do together, right? All the people I've ever met in my life combined, Rupert Murdoch has more political power than all of them. He's kind of ruined a media and political culture in the UK, Australia, and he's kind of doing it here too, right? He's got immense political power. Social media, Elon Musk bought a whole bloody website, and he's ruining that. We have David Smith, and now that's impacting news here in Baltimore. So my thought is that we just need to be, I think, again, the holistic solution and the holistic problem, part of the problem is vast inequalities of wealth translating into vast inequalities of political power. I think that's fundamentally at odds with democracy, and we do need to tackle it. Otherwise, we're not going to address the actual issue, I think.
Yeah. Could I wanted to just touch on something that we haven't covered, but I think is really essential to this conversation, which is what is news and what are the platforms that people are getting it on. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Twitter or X or
Let's
Elon
call it
Musk.
Twitter.
But I think, you know, across the country, we're seeing the demise of a lot of newspapers. The number of newspapers is, you know, decreased dramatically over the last 20 years. They're closing, they're under financial stress. And one of the reasons is because people feel like they're getting information in other places. It may or may not be actual news, but they feel like they are informed. And I think, you know, in a world of AI, in a world of, you know, Twitter, this is really scary. And when I go today, I think there are a lot of college students here tonight, but if I go and ask college students, where are you getting your news? Many of them will actually tell me that the starting place for where they get their news is Instagram or TikTok. And, you know, sometimes it's legitimate news accounts on Instagram and TikTok, but sometimes it's not. And that's not to say that there aren't people actually presenting news in a good and useful form on those platforms, but it's scary if that's, you know, where people are getting their news today. And especially because it's also in like 10-second reels. And I don't know if that's enough information to make a decision.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so that's great. I mean, I appreciate both the sort of like very concrete experiential perspective and also the sort of big picture structural angle on basically the same set of problems, right? How should media be funded and how should it work in a democratic society?
Well, in California, it's worth noting, in California, there's a lot going on right now related to the funding of journalism. And there has been a recent move to provide government funding to news organizations in the state. But some of that funding is coming through Google and big tech. And there are a lot of people who have a lot of concerns about that. And there are initiatives underway in different states to have government step in and sort of bail out the news industry in the way that it's bailed out many other industries. And I think, you know, the larger kind of future question about government funding of media is also an interesting conundrum.
Yeah, because the same problems that arise with private funders can also arise with government funders, right? Namely, they want to have a hand in editorial.
I mean, PBS is often raised today by mostly Republicans, but, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Project 2025 calls for the elimination of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is the entity behind both NPR and PBS.
The BBC, I mean, it's interesting in the UK where public-funded, public broadcast, it's okay, it's generally decent. I mean, I think I'm very much in favour of public funding for journalism and news. It's obviously a public good, it's a crucial part of our democracy. Like we publicly fund courts, we attempt to publicly fund our legal system, but also have some independence. We should just do the same with news media. But again, it doesn't solve everything. So you mentioned before the UK's got a toxic kind of tabloid press culture. It's also Murdoch owns a lot of those presses and has just relentlessly attacked the BBC. Relentlessly attacks them. Oh, the BBC is paying some presenter a decent amount of money? Let's relentlessly attack that. Taxpayer funds going towards that. The BBC covers an issue a little too much this way, it'll get relentlessly attacked. So I think overall it's a good thing, but it doesn't really solve the issues kind of on its own.
All right, I think let's shift to questions from the audience now. But thanks very much to you all for a great discussion.
Of course.
Yeah. Lots of questions.
Thank you for that very interesting discussion. You've touched on this issue, I believe. I'd like to pursue it a little more, please. The issue of the problem of epistemic bubbles, where people get their news solely from a network of sources that spreads information, conspiracy theories, and that sort of thing. Do you think that as journalists and philosophers, is there anything that any particular role that you could play in combating that?
Combating conspiracy theories and disinformation.
The problem of like epistemic bubbles, that people have these inclusive networks that spread this
Polarization.
information, that they buy into it and don't. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there is this philosopher T. Nguyen at the University of Utah who's got a nice paper on this. Some of the philosophers in the audience might know. So there's a philosopher at the University of Utah who's drawn a distinction here. So he wants to distinguish between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. It's a kind of artificial way of doing it, but who cares? He's getting insight there are two different kinds of things. So he thinks an epistemic bubble is basically relatively harmless. So here's how he describes them. So an epistemic bubble is just when like-minded people gather, basically. And he's like, that's just what kind of friendship in life is. You know, you surround yourself with people with similar values. He said, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not going to be ideal as an information gathering network. So he says, you know, these things make for great parties or a great barbecue, but it's not the best way to get the most amount of information because you're all likely considering the same sources. So why is that relatively harmless? Well, I think his thought is that's relatively harmless because reality can pop through that bubble. So let's say that, you know, you and your friends are all kind of Democrats and you support the Democratic Party, and before Biden goes into his debate, you're like, you know, he's not too old and all this, he's going to do it. And then the debate happens, and then you go, oh no. and you know, I live in the UK, but I follow American politics, and I just watched reality seeping in amongst kind of Democratic commentators, being like, actually, this needs to change, and so on and so forth. So that would be a bubble. You've got like-minded people, similar values, they share the same kind of, you know, they get their news from the same sources, but reality does get through. Then what he says is the more insidious case is what he calls echo chambers, and he thinks they're much more cult-like, right? And the worry there is that reality doesn't get through, not because they're not exposed to other sources, but because that they're taught to actively discredit other sources of information. So he's like, that's what happens with an indoctrination into a cult. It's not that you're blocked off from anyone who disagrees with you, but you learn ways to discredit what they think. And what's so harmful about that is that reality doesn't get through, right? Again, think about the most recent debate. Again, you know, did reality seep through after that debate? No, right? So I think that would be something that's really worrying, is that there's groups of people who are being basically indoctrinated into a cult such that reality doesn't get through. So what to do about that? His suggestion in that paper is that more information won't help. Exposing those people to other sources, more information doesn't help and can be counterproductive because they're already kind of trained to dismiss that. He thinks that the key there is, funnily enough, re-establishing trust. So re-establishing trust with other people, with other groups, with other communities, that kind of interpersonal dimension can bring you back in. And he notes that that's typically how people leave cults, right? They come to trust outsiders and actually realize they're okay. So sorry, that was a lot, but it's a really good paper by T. Nguyen, Echo Chambers and Epistemic Bubbles, if you're interested in it.
Hello? Okay, cool, sorry. So for context, I'm the managing editor of an academic journal. And I often think about this, and I've seen in my career how we will publish research which then goes to be reported by science journalists, various news media outlets, more public-facing media sources. And while, speaking to what you all were discussing earlier about journalism being, fact delivering or truth or things like that, which I also think is interesting, but often the research that is published is, digested and regurgitated in a way that is more palatable for the audience. Obviously, everybody can't go and read, a very dense article on quantum computing that we've published. But while some of the stuff that we publish leads to publications that do have very public concerns with them, whether that be things that might have dual use concerns, research on demographics, new medical research on vaccines. And I guess my question is do you all have a sense, coming from the opposite side of where I am, of what ethical obligation academic publishing should have in making sure that that information is reported accurately? We have obviously somewhat relationships with certain types of journalists, science reporters. They can subscribe to our RSS feeds, they can get our tip sheets. But once we go through all this work of peer reviewing some research and publishing it, I think it's interesting that we suddenly decide that our job is done when it comes to sort of the stewardship of how that information is disseminated. And so I'm wondering, beyond obviously the global questions, how do you fight disinformation? Or wouldn't it be great if all this information was open access? Yes, obviously, that would be really helpful. But where does that relationship end for us, and maybe should it go further, and how might that look?
I think that you can and should continue to be the steward of your research. I'm a believer in if a news story is based on your research, you should be credited with that research. Your original academic paper should be cited as a source. You should be interviewed as an expert, and if the article misrepresents your work, I think you have every right to call them out. I don't know if that's is that the question you're asking?
I suppose part of it as well is it goes back a little bit to the very first question you asked, where we said, because in a way, we're not so different, you and I, right?
Yeah.
We're all trying to be educational. We're
Right.
all trying to kind of look at the problems that are facing society and say something about it. But academia is really slow and it's not public facing. That's part of the issue. And then everything for us is it's published, it's done. Okay, now kind of go back to another one or something like that. And it's a kind of shame that happens, that we stop there and that maybe it gets picked up by, For most of us, it doesn't, but maybe it gets picked up, for some academics, and it gets taken with. But I guess that's partly what you're saying, right? It's a shame that there's a gap there, and that we're not doing anything to fill it. No one's meeting us.
Yes, I think there's an interesting disconnect in that we're both in sort of the business of publishing. We're both in the business of disseminating information that is relevant to the public. I mean, often you'll see an article that's published that says, in a recent article published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, they found this. Or in the New England Journal of Medicine, new research published says this. And, let's be honest, most of the public aren't going to go back and read the source material, even if you cite it. And part of, the job of the journalist is to find a way to present this in a context that could be understandable to the average person. And I don't think it's ridiculous to say that maybe some of that is lost in that translation. And I don't think you need to be a bad actor to present research in a way, through your sort of journalistic act, that in a way that isn't, maybe by necessity as nuanced as the original research that was published. And so as a journal, where, I'm not doing the research, I'm publishing it. I'm putting it through its paces to make sure that it's, peer reviewed and that it, went through all of the hoops that it had to jump through to be published. Once it's published, there's no real mechanism in place, as far as I'm aware, that when I see that my article was cited in, the New York Times, for us to then follow up and say, hey, the way that you presented this is not actually accurate. Despite your best intentions, that's not how these statistics work, or that's not how this, the way that this study was set up doesn't actually give you the conclusions that you think it's giving as you're putting it into a greater context for the public. And so I'm wondering I guess, if that clarifies my question, what should that relationship look like? And, should there be that relationship? Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I guess I would say to you what I would say to anybody who feels that their point of view has been misrepresented or misconstrued is, and it's on you to talk to the reporter. I mean, most reporters have emails or are pretty readily accessible. And I know if I had misinterpreted something factually, I would want to hear from the person who I had misrepresented, and that is there something that would be keeping you from reaching out to them? I mean, we probably don't want to take a whole lot more time on this, but.
For instance, when we find out that something that we published, there was an issue with the research, we'll publish a retraction, or we'll publish a correction. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the time, maybe it's easy to have this idealistic idea that journalism reports truth. I mean, I think that opens up a lot of, pretty difficult questions. Like, Werner Herzog once said something like, if facts and truth are really that interesting, the phone book would be the most interesting book in the world. And I think there's some truth to that. And part of me wonders, maybe this is going off my question, I promise other people can answer, but I won't put off myself. Part of me wonders whether or not these ideas of truth, fact reporting are actually compatible with a real, what journalism is actually trying to do in a democracy. And if that's the case, then it's not just me coming and saying, hey, Fox News, you said this really crazy thing that was way off base, versus, hey, New York Times, you've just been presented in the most accurate light, because obviously it's not possible. There's this gray area. And that's all.
Yeah, I mean, just to put an end to that, your question, though, I would just say, most credible news organizations believe in correcting work that is inaccurate. So I would always reach out if you see something that's mistaken.
All right. Hi, I'm a freshman student at UMBC. This is a hopefully simple question. In regards to you guys talking about wealth inequalities affecting political power and how big tech companies are often owned by these massively wealthy companies that own social media platforms where young people get their news mainly from memes. How would you say the effects of social media affects our democracy if if these massive companies have a vested interest in platforms that don't do a very good job of reporting high quality journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's not. I mean, it goes back to something that Kemi was saying earlier, where you were saying that actually, think about legacy media, right? The trust in legacy media is declining, but it's also not without reason that it's been declining. I mean, go to any major paper and look at their history. There's going to be all sorts of things in which they've got wrong, and there's going to be all sorts of ways in which they have thrown their way around politically. So it's not that our legacy institutions on this are perfect. That being said, yeah, social media is obviously a complete mess. I mean, it's a fairly recent experiment, and it seems to be a bit of a disaster. We now have huge corporations that are kind of wielding, huge power. They've not been broke up. They've not been effectively regulated. They have huge amount of wealth. Part of the reason, as far as I understand it, that journalism's in decline is because ad revenue's in decline, and ad revenue's in decline because Facebook and Google kind of took it all, and that's kind of decimated print media and local news, so it's had all sorts of knock-on effects. But yeah, I mean, also it's just, I don't know, it's all kind of happening as we speak, right? Elon Musk bought Twitter and is now turned into a kind of weird far-right guy who's just posting nonsense every day. I mean, it's hard to keep up. Like I said, academia is slow. I mean, I was trying to write a paper on what I thought the political significance of Twitter was based on my experience of it in the first year of the pandemic, where I just sat at home and scrolled Twitter all the time, and I thought, well, this can't be good. Let's think about this. But it's all changing so much that, yeah, I don't know, to be honest. It doesn't look great though.
I mean, the crazy thing about social media is I'm actually a big believer in us being on it. I mean, the Banner has a very robust Instagram account. We are on TikTok. The people that are our sort of personalities on Instagram are among our best representatives of the Banner. I mean, the guy who's on our TikTok, anywhere he goes, people are like, hey, do you work for the Banner? I mean, he's like well known in this town. And I think that as news organizations, we have to go where the readers are. We can't rely on readers just to organically come to us. So if everybody under 30 or 20 or 25 is on TikTok, maybe we need to be there too. It's just, how do we cut through the noise, and how do we present ourselves as a fact-based, report versus everything else that's on there. So I think social media is a real double-edged sword. It's an extremely powerful tool that can be used for the good or not.
And what happens to nuance when it's a 20-second TikTok?
And that, yeah.
But I take your point that
Yeah.
I mean, there are also these worries with it that the simplest form of it I've put is that the algorithms all want to keep you engaged as long as possible, right? That's how they get information about you, but also sell you ads, but also information about you to see ads. So these technologies are all designed to keep us paying attention for as long as possible. And it turns out that the weird kind of strange, evolved, weird-brained creature that we are, the thing that is the most addictive to us is kind of moral outrage, right? That's the thing that is like, really shortcuts our brains and will keep us kind of going online. And so that the algorithms reward and promote content that engenders this kind of moral outrage. And that's addictive, but it does kind of lead to polarization and these sorts of worries. So I think you're right. If you need to reach people and young people, and they're on TikTok, go on TikTok. But if we're kind of stepping back and thinking about, are these harmful and what are they doing to us? The fact that they're kind of engendering and furthering moral outrage is probably not good for us, would help explain kind of the current predicament we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I think that feeling of that affective response is a very good way to sort of shut down our ability to think clearly about things, right? So if the news that you're consuming is constantly like hitting you with that affect, right, then it becomes very hard to think well, basically, about the world, right? And I think that's a very serious concern.
So yeah, I wanted to pretty much ask, so I think the same way we've like talked at end about all these different historical factors that have kind of brought us into our current situation, whether we're talking about like, let's say the nationalization of media, the rise of internet and social media, like polarization, like all these different things which have like contributed to the current situation. I do wonder if we're also kind of understating the potential of historical factors to sort of pull us out of this current situation or to sort of self-correct in a way. So for example, like, when we're like looking right now about like how TikTok is being used, what we're seeing is like oftentimes like a lot of these influencers, like we see corporations, like they see that it's more popular and they begin pushing like a lot of their narratives, their press releases to there, or even see with like political parties, they'll oftentimes eschew traditional journalism, especially in this recent election, in favor of like prioritizing social media, prioritizing these social media influencers, prioritizing TikTok, et cetera. So, and I think with it, eventually, I think in the long term, what we're going to see is as they sort of tend to push the narratives, which I already see this in like some online communities, a distrust of influencers due to the fact that like you can tell they're parroting press releases, you can tell they're parroting a lot of narratives, or even I guess like we're talking about like say the power of AI and misinformation, right? The fact that we even rely on photo and like video and audio evidence, that's very much a product of a very modern era in what, very recently, like within the past century, where we were even able to use those sorts of information as independent, like completely indisputable stores of truth. Like before that, we still had journalism, but we still had other ways of verifying information. So I wonder if like the industry will just adapt. And I do wonder if the ways in which we sort of panic assume that, oh, this is fundamental to human nature, this is just sort of fundamental to collapse democracy, we need to bring in government to bail out the journalism industry, we might need more regulation, et cetera. Whether we're sort of almost kind of jumping the gun and because at the same time as like we talk about journalism and the way we dispense information, we also have to talk about how people themselves, how they learn to trust information, whether they trust it uncritically. And of course, that's going to be related to the media they consume. And I think it's something that could correct itself over time.
You're more of an optimist, perhaps. I mean, you could be right. I mean, I'd be curious. I don't know. I mean, yeah. I will just say that newspaper, I think 2.5, I wish I had the stat fresh in my mind, but literally every week or every other week, there's a news organization closing. It's that dire in the United States. So if I wouldn't say we have a lot of time to self-correct on this. I mean, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the NPRs, they will likely, be around forever. Will the Baltimore Banner, will the Baltimore Beat, will some of the smaller organizations be around?
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about what self-correcting means, right? I mean, is that people getting together, organizing, deciding to switch to, consume different forms of news? Is it people voting in certain ways? So yeah, I'm kind of hopeful that there's a way out of this, but I don't think it's a kind of let's just sit back and see it unfold. I don't think that's going to work. I mean, part of it is just like thinking about the reality of the political situation that you face in the States right now, but also all over the world. I mean, authoritarian governments are on the rise. The far right's on the rise. In the UK at the minute, the demonization of immigrants is on the rise. So the UK voted for Brexit in 2016. Some of you might have heard of this disaster. Total disaster, no benefit to the country, serious harm to basically everyone. And you think, why did this happen? Well, the Daily Express, the month before Brexit, I think it was a 31-day month, and 29 of the covers it ran were dehumanizing immigrants, right? And it's got worse since then. So that's the kind of like media environment that we kind of face. And so, yeah, I have some hope it'll get better, but I don't think it's going to self-correct. I don't think that power self-corrects. I mean, I'm not a historian, but my sense is that power needs to be fought and needs to be resisted. So we can self-correct, but we'll have to challenge power to do that. But power doesn't typically self-correct. It'll hoard and consume power until things go horribly wrong, which is what's happening. Right?
That is a form of self-correction.
A certain form. Yeah.
Something going horribly wrong.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
I mean, sort of following up on Joe's thought, I mean, I think that the reason, a large part of the reason that we're in the media environment that we're in is because the economic incentives, given the political economy of how this all works, have pushed us in this direction, right? It's the way that very wealthy people can make more money off of media, right? And so if the economic incentives are pushing us in the direction that we're going, right? I really worry about the possibility of like the system self-correcting, right? It seems like the economic incentives are not set up in the right way, basically, for that self-correction to just sort of occur as an organic part of the media ecosystem.
Over here. A lot of my work is around training public health professionals to counter misinformation and disinformation. It's so rampant in the health space. I know I don't need to tell you that. But a question we get all the time is, how could we be communicating better during times of uncertainty? So, when we're hearing that people are storming the Capitol, or we're hearing that CDC says, you don't need to wear masks, but then tomorrow they say, please wear masks. Or a high-level Ministry of Defense official from Russia is saying, oh, we have to invade Ukraine because they have biological weapons. Like what ethical frameworks, what heuristic frameworks, or just what techniques could we be using in the field of journalism, or even with the public health professionals I work with, to be communicating better when we don't know what the truth is, or we don't know what the facts are?
I'm struggling a bit because those are such wildly different scenarios that you're laying out there, and I'm going to maybe focus on the one that you're directly connected with, which is public health and conveying information about public health. And I think to the extent that you can express healthy doubt about what you're saying, people might be more inclined to believe you. So if something has changed and you can express that in a way that makes sense, and admit that what we thought 6 months ago is no longer true, and here's why, I think that goes a long way toward building public trust. I don't know if that's really answering your question. And I think a lot of it is sort of framing how we frame what we know. And if you can say, this is the best information we have at the time, and now 6 months later, we actually have new information, and here's what it is, and here's why what we said 6 months ago was not quite right. I know it's never comfortable to admit that you were wrong about something, but I think to the extent that you can be forthright about that and transparent, I think that probably goes a long way toward building trust. I don't know if that answers what your question is about that. And the sort of the bigger questions, which is, when you know something is factually untrue, like you mentioned Russia and Ukraine, I think as journalists, it's incumbent on us to be very explicit in calling things out when we know them to be untrue. And I think a lot of our language as journalists has been kind of wishy-washy about things that are just patently false. And I think we could do everyone a pretty big service by being much more clear when we know something to be untrue, to be saying that it's untrue. I think there's one school of thought that by repeating a lie, it just becomes much more entrenched, even if you're trying to debunk the lie. And I think the way that we frame that narrative is really important. So if something is wrong, you can't just let it sit out there, right? You have to explicitly say this is untrue. And if you're going to repeat the thing that is untrue, you need to be very clear in labeling it as untrue, often before it and after it, at least on the air. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay.
Hello? Oh, hello. Kind of similarly related to that question, I thought your point about how more information doesn't actually help in rebuilding trust. And I had a question about what kind of, it's something that was brought up in the political debate that I've been thinking about, where I had a conversation with my uncle where he had some views in which I was like, how the heck do you believe this kind of stuff? And I was talking with my family and they were like, give him a break. He's kind of having a tough time. And I understand that these politicians are preying on these vulnerable people, but these vulnerable people are like in these situations in which they are like worrying about their grocery prices, and how do we reach these people who are being fed literally hundreds and hundreds of posts of immediate social media posts versus they don't want to read like this one biased news source because they have hundreds of other things telling them other things that will promise them that they will get out of their situation. I guess my question is, how do we reach these vulnerable people who are a lot more susceptible to being basically indoctrinated into cults?
I mean, I think this gets back to your example about the paper at the University of Utah.
Yeah, in that case, it was. So he's got this example of basically a neo-Nazi who ends up, you might know this case, I think a relatively well-known case, but a neo-Nazi who basically, I think, befriends a Jewish guy and comes to basically realise that what he's been told isn't true. But it's a really kind of touching story, but it just feels like that can't be the answer. We can't send Jewish people around to all the Nazis and have them patiently work through their Nazism. That's not, we can't, that's not going to work. But it kind of is interesting that he puts it forward as a solution, because I guess the thought is something about interpersonal trust, right? So, I mean, I don't know, what the hell do I know? But my hunch is, can you have a conversation with your uncle? Can you meet him where he is and at least hear him out? And then once that's happened, the heat's out of it, and then maybe you can get in. I mean, I think you have to meet people where they are. You have to hear their concerns. You don't have to end it there, but maybe we have to start there. But yeah, I don't know. Do you?
I mean, we could solve a lot of problems if we could solve this one. I don't know. I mean, I think you have to not give up. I think you have to try to engage with people on a human level, and not. And I agree with you. I think it's presenting someone that the other person can relate to, right? At the end of the day, breaking through that.
Well, I just want to real quick tack on to the end of that. I feel like it was with a 5-minute car ride, so there wasn't a lot of time to debate. But the thing that he threw at me was like, this was on the news, and I saw this. Like they were saying there's videos, and like how we're saying about, there's so much misinformation, and how do we combat, because there's already so much distrust within the media, like how do I tell him maybe that source isn't reliable, and him being back to me is like, yes it is. How do you like debate that?
I mean, maybe you need to find one very specific thing that calls what he thinks into question and show him that.
Yeah, that can be a way to do it, right? So, God, how to get the story out quickly. So, someone I know, they have a family member as well, similar kind of situation, very much being drawn into a kind of toxic media sphere. But then there was something happening in their town, right? In which they were like, there's this thing happening and it's crazy. I'm like, well, go look at what the kind of national media is saying about it. And one of the national media is kind of repeating the lies and all this stuff, and the others are not, and are saying, we're not sure. So if there's a way in which you can kind of find something that he knows about or cares about and show the way in which their favorite media sources are distorting that could help or be a way to get through. That helped in this one case. But again, I don't know. Like you say, if we had a solution to these, we'd...
I also think there are certainly some people who are more persuadable than others. I'm thinking that in 2008, before the election in October, I was doing a story in the Midwest. We were in Hannibal, Missouri, hometown of Mark Twain. And I met this lovely older couple, and we were talking about a bunch of things, and Mark Twain and the river, and then we started talking about the election. I said, what do you think about the election, and what do you think about Obama, who was running then for the first time? And they're like, oh no. They said, I heard he wants to change the national anthem to I Want to Teach the World to Sing. And I'm like, whoa, I mean, we're way beyond the birther conspiracy at this point. We're like, I'm like, wow, where did you hear that? And they said, oh, somebody sent it to me in an email. And so, I mean, I have a feeling if I had sat down with them and had time over half an hour of coffee, I could probably have convinced them that Barack Obama did not want to change the national anthem to I Want to Teach the World to Sing. But Another guy that I met in Alaska who was convinced that Obama's a Muslim, I don't know that there would have been anything I could have said to him. So ideally, is it your uncle? I can't remember, your grandfather, your uncle. Maybe he's persuadable. Maybe he would listen to reason. Maybe if you presented him with facts, he might be convinced. Well, there is that. But enough of them, maybe that would overcome that. So.
There we are. Hi, I am a political science major here at UMBC. I wanted to open up the discussion more upon social media and journalism being kind of faced on opposing forces and forced against each other, when at the same time, this is not me coming as a defense of social media, but both are accused of the same problems almost. Both are accused of causing or fueling the fires of political polarization in this country. And something I wanted to open up the discussion of is, how can journalism try to stay away from fueling that political polarization? Because it's often more than not that the reason why a lot of the public has continued to increase in distrust of the media is because they're constantly being faced with us versus them rhetoric in journalism, and ideas of which are really conflicting as consumers, as people that are just reading and wanting to just see the news. It's very difficult to be able to talk to people of different political ideas and views when media is bombarding you with all these different types of political polarizations. And what I wanted to ask or open up the conversation on is, sometimes it feels like journalism is in it for the clicks and for the views just as much as social media is. So I wanted to open up the conversation on that and how we feel that journalism can go back to a time where it's less distrusted.
I mean, that's a good question. And, you know, I think part of the problem is that media is also in a fight for survival. So it needs clicks, it needs audience, it needs viewers to, you know, pay for itself. And that's actually part of the problem. I mean, I like to blame a lot of media's problems on cable news. I don't know if that's fair, but I think certainly that has fueled some of the polarization. Cable news is a 24-hour operation, and it began to be filled with a lot more than just news. It began to be filled with a lot of opinion. And I think some of that opinion, because it's presented on these news networks, gets mistaken for what I think is actual news. But I mean, I agree with you. I think, you know, we are living in a world of clicks and, you know, views. I mean, I think we try to not cater to that. We try to, I mean, the Baltimore Banner tries to not cater to that, but I certainly am aware of, I mean, before we launched, we did a lot of surveys from people, and they were like, we don't want to read about crime. You know, we don't want to hear about the bad things that are happening in Baltimore. Let me tell you, we try to write about the good things that are happening and the bad things that are happening. What stories do you think people are reading? They're not reading the happy stories we're telling.
It's interesting that as well, because the takes me back to this kind of thought that this has got the problem and the solution are both going to be holistic. So again, what Murdoch will say, if he would talk about this stuff, when he does, is that people, you know, sure, I do trashy tabloids and we have kind of cable news around the clock and it's provocative and it's exaggerated, but that's what people want. People want that. I give people what they really want. And there's some truth to that. There's also a bit of a lie, right? He's also shaping people's preferences. That's, you know, kind of the point of it. But there is part of us that does like that. And again, this was something that popped up when I was chatting with these journalists in Norway, because there's a tabloid paper there, but it's really good. I mean, it's entertaining, but high quality and holds itself to good standards. And I said, how do you do this? And they were like, well, look, our population's kind of quite educated and actually likes to read things, and they wouldn't want to read what you guys read in the UK. And again, I was like, all right, fair enough, again, good for Norway. But I guess the point I'm making is that the solution has to be holistic too. It can't just be the media. You need to have good education, you need to have education continuing throughout your life, you need to have a healthy public sphere, public discourse, all these things. And as they start to crumble, they all kind of fall in on each other.
So we're going to take one more question, and the interest here shows how important these conversations are, so thank you all.
Hi, good evening. Dr. Sanders, this is a question for you. So I know you mentioned the World Press Freedom Index in the beginning when we were talking about freedom in media across the world. And I had a question about ethics. So the journalists which operate in countries like Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands, do you believe that the people working as journalists are fundamentally more ethical than people working as journalists here? Because why is there such a big discrepancy in the decisions being made?
Yeah, great. Really good question. So, no, of course not, right? It's not that like people in Norway are better people somehow. That'd be weird. It's culture. It goes back to what you guys were saying in response to the very first question, that there's this culture of ethical issues. So I got told by people who work on journalism studies in the UK that the UK in particular has a real toxic culture. And that actually, a lot of the people who are employed as journalists go in there as young 20-somethings who are quite idealistic. They've went to university and they've studied journalism or communication, and they've been taught journalism tells truth to power, right? That's what you do. You speak truth to power. And they think, oh, what a wonderful thing. Then they show up and they're immediately brought into a culture that doesn't do that, that's totally toxic, and they're just kind of corrupted. And they say, you can see it. These are like lecturers, professors telling me, they can see it happen in former students of theirs. The culture in the UK is one of a kind of a renegade who doesn't play by the rules. This is this kind of self-image, right? Kind of like the Maverick. The press, they do what they want. They're not bound by the rules. And it's a kind of self-aggrandizing self-image, because that's not really what they do. Really, they're kind of in bed with power and just crap on immigrants and benefit claims. But that's not a very nice self-image. So, and then when I talked to the journalists in Norway, I said, well, what's it like? And I spoke to like senior journalists, and junior journalists. And the senior journalist said, if we get a new journalist in, the very first thing we're doing is talking to them. And part of what we, teach them is this is part of the culture. And they'll say some of the young journalists don't quite get it. And they're out to make a name for themselves, to get a big story, to get big clicks, but they're not quite seeing the kind of ethical implications of what they might do. So you just have a culture in that the people that you respect and your work and look up to are constantly giving you kind of ethical advice. So yeah, in short, no, it's not the individuals, it's all culture.
Small follow-up. So do you believe changing the culture in big news companies like New York Times, LA Times, Providence Journal would fundamentally help reshape society in these aspects? Because as somebody who consumes media every day, particularly from news organizations, like I rely on what those people are telling me, and it does shape how I live and how I see society. So do you think the training which senior members, and then like you said, people see the shift in culture, they see how dangerous it can be. So do you think fundamentally changing how we approach this would make a difference?
Yeah, I do, and I suppose you have to think that, right? Or you just give up. So I suppose there are two. Something I was reading recently was suggesting there are two kind of types of culture. There's micro and macro culture in news organizations. So the macro would be the kind of big things we're talking about. What the funding model is, what the economic pressures are, what the regulation is. It's the kind of macro issues, and those do really shape the culture. We need to sort those out. But then there's the kind of the micro culture that applies within the news organization, how editors speak to journalists, how journalists treat sources, and all of that obviously can be improved too. And we can't just offer a magical fix to any of these. What we have to do is just find some area of the world that's currently not functioning well and just get stuck in and try and make little bits of it function better. And hopefully there'll be kind of a virtuous cycle, whereas some of these things start getting better, it casts light on some of these other things, and it all kind of works. Does that make sense as people who've worked inside news organizations? Do you believe in the kind of microculture you can?
I mean, absolutely. I think particularly since in a post-Floyd, George Floyd era, we're seeing a lot of micro changes within news organizations. I mean, a lot more emphasis on, you know, the culture within the newsroom, and I mean, even generally speaking, there's been a unionization effort across news organizations that is changing a lot of culture at newsroom, pay, equity issues, how we treat employees, how we think about the safety of our workers. I mean, some of this is generational shifts in how young workers today expect to be treated. But I mean, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're referring to, but I think there's a lot of changes happening within organizations right now too.
All right. So thank you all so much for your outstanding questions. Thank you to our panelists for their outstanding answers. So join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you.